I'm making a retro sci-fi shooter called Scarlet Harvest in the easy FPS Editor game engine, and in this series of videos I'm explaining what I've learned so far. Last time we looked at why I picked this engine and how I went about creating atmospheric levels and simple 3D assets to fill them. In this video, I'll be explaining how combat works in EFFSE, and the choices I made to provide variety and challenge. Before I created a single level in Easy FPS Editor, I was sketching weapon designs. I wanted the game's arsenal to reflect 90s FPS games, where feel and uniqueness was prioritized over realism. I wanted each weapon to offer a different type of combat. EFFSE supports melee, projectile-based and hit-scan weapons, and offers several parameters you can tweak to get guns feeling different from one another. Due to time constraints, I ended up modeling and texturing just two weapons, a projectile-based handgun and a hit-scan-based semi-automatic shotgun, both akin to similar weapons in Quake 2. I kept them low poly and chunky to help fit the aesthetic of the game. A third weapon, a railgun, was modelled but never finished. Hopefully I can add this to a future version of the game. With the weapons modelled and textured, I then rigged and animated them in frag motion as if I was going to import them into Game Guru or FPS-C. But this time I only needed a handful of animations, as EFFSE only supports fire and reload animations. That saved a lot of time. Unfortunately, it was only here that I realised that the arms were going to look weird on the shotgun, but I just decided to run with it anyway and fix it some other time. Exporting the animated weapons from frag motion as FBX, I then re-imported them back into Blender, lit and rendered selected frames as PNGs, and then applied the same contrast and posterize effects in After Effects as I had for my 2D assets, and added muzzle flashes. Importing these final PNGs into EFFSE is super straightforward, and not having to actually get the weapon models themselves working in a game engine was a massive time saver. All I needed now was some punchy sound effects, but I didn't want anything in the game to look or sound too high fidelity, so I deliberately undersampled almost every sound effect in the game to 11,050 Hz, instead of the more normal 44,100 or 48,000 Hz. To me, this only added another layer of retro charm. For the enemies, I wanted to adopt a similar approach as for the weapons. Every enemy needed to offer a different challenge. I also wanted each enemy to look distinct from one another, so the player could tell at a distance what challenge was being offered. I started by sketching an enemy with a melee attack. My plan was to model and texture the enemy myself, then use Mixamo to rig and animate him, then render those animations as 2D sprites. Sadly, Mixamo doesn't play well with non-humanoid characters, so this limited how otherworldly I could make the aliens. But I played around with the proportions of everything as much as I could to get something unusual, eventually modelling the head twice to get a look I was happy with. With my alien modelled and textured, I got him into Mixamo and exported animations for idle, running, attacking, flinching, and dying. To give more variety, I exported two different death animations. I would later use these to create A and B versions of the same alien, to make combat encounters less uniform. Back in Blender, I rendered 256 by 256 stills of each animation. It saved a huge amount of time not having to make all the animations line up and not having to get the alien model itself working in-engine. Instead, I just rendered the stills, applied my usual filters in After Effects to degrade the quality, and imported them into EFFSE. As with the weapons, I sourced royalty-free sound effects and exported them at 11,050 Hz to degrade them. The melee enemies offer a straightforward challenge for the player, pressing up close to them. But I knew I also wanted to have an enemy with a projectile-based attack that could apply pressure from distance. After more sketches, I got back into Blender to model and UV map my alien soldier. By this point, I was getting a lot more proficient with Blender's UV mapping tools and making textures in Photoshop. I even worked out how to parent the alien gun I made to the skeleton Mixamo had generated for my alien soldier. Importing the sprites for the soldier was easy at first, but then I realised he was firing his laser from his knees. That's because I'd used the scale function in the editor to scale down his sprites. It took a bit of trial and error, playing with the scale of the enemy but also the resolution of the sprite itself to get him firing from roughly the right height. If you're enjoying this video so far, give this video a like or subscribe so you don't miss my next video. My first 2 levels in the hospital were deliberately slower paced and mostly only featured melee enemies to ease the player in. But for level 3, I wanted an action-packed shootout in an underground car park. I took huge inspiration from a video by Andrew Yoder on combat encounter design. In it, he breaks down the different ways level layout and enemy placement can present different challenges to the player. I was so inspired, I started sketching possible encounters the player could have. Corridors where the player needed to play dodgeball with projectile firing enemies. Rooms with melee enemies pressing whilst a projectile-based enemy stands back firing. In designing the car park level, I basically just tried to link as many of these encounters together as possible, gradually escalating the difficulty. It was a fun challenge trying to balance the desire to provide interesting combat encounters with the need to still make the level feel like an authentic underground car park. Even though from an art perspective, the concrete walls and floors are a little dull, the actual layout and lighting makes this level my favourite so far. I'm definitely going to take these lessons forward for future levels. Also, big shout out to GG.net. I used his royalty-free PSX style car models throughout the level. If I'd just stopped there, I'd have had a pretty fun little shooter with a couple of weapons and a couple of enemies. But, as usual, I wanted to tell a deeper story. That not only meant creating engaging characters, but also getting to grips with EFFSE Editor's scripting capabilities. In the next video, I'll talk about how I used AI to create both the look and the voice of the character Reva, and how I took my first steps into scripting to deliver a more satisfying experience. Thanks for watching.